Hello, fun people! I'm Isaac Carlson, and on Following Dreams, I'm focused on exploring the stories of people who are following their passions and achieving their dreams. I want to help inspire you to pursue what you love by hearing how others have done it. But before we welcome our guest for today, be sure to take part in all of the magical places on the internet that I live. You can find all my discussions on the wonderful world of Disney on my YouTube channel, Wotso Videos. Be sure to follow my adventures on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Wotso Videos. Consider supporting the show by joining my Discord and becoming a producer of the show over at patreon.com/WotsoVideos and getting the Following Dreams merchandise at wotsostore.com. Feel free to send me a comment or question at followingdreamspodcast@gmail.com, and if you enjoy what this show is doing, be sure to rate us over on iTunes. Today's guest is a writer who has been a lifelong Disney fan who has broken through into the animation world. He went from writing stand-up comedy to the feature Saving Santa to freelancing for Dragon's Race to the Edge, all until his journey brought him to become a staff writer at Walt Disney Television Animation. With experience on Disney's Mickey Mouse, Big Hero 6 The Series, Tangled The Series, and currently Monsters at Work, he's helped shape classic characters and their stories through his words. To follow him everywhere on the internet, you can find links down below. Welcome, Ricky Roxburgh.
Hi, Isaac.
Hello, I'm so glad that you're here to discuss what you've done and been able to accomplish today. Thanks for being here.
Oh, glad to be here.
Right away, I want to know, what are you passionate about? What gets you really excited to be involved in animation?
Ooh, it's just something I grew up on and gravitated to. Disney movies in particular are my sweet spot, and my mom was just a huge Disney fanatic, and she raised me on those movies, and so when I was a kid, that was all I watched. And then as I grew up, I continued to watch it and grew up in quotation marks. I just continued to watch animated movies and shows, and I just person, and I love things that are fun and whimsical and adventurous. Tug at your heartstrings and stuff, and Disney always did that for me. It always kind of covered all those bases, and so also when I was younger, it was a little bit different. Now it's a little different now that special effects, I feel like live action movies are cartoons as well, because anything can happen. But when I was growing up, animation was kind of, everything was a special effect in a way. And so it was just a way to watch stories that you wouldn't normally see play out in the real world, and really, I don't know, just see characters that you wouldn't normally meet, and see the world from a different perspective. So it's always just been something that I've been drawn into in those ways.
That's something I hadn't really thought about before, that since the special effects in movies weren't always as refined as they are now, especially with computers and computer-generated images, the whole idea of being able to immerse yourself into an underwater world like The Little Mermaid would have been something completely unattainable in any other medium. So yeah, it's incredible to think about that. Those stories were really only possible at the time through animation.
Yeah, it's true. I was watching that movie Aquaman. It was out, the DC movie,
sure.
And that's an anime. I mean, the Avengers movies are basically like animated movies. I mean, they're because they just take place. Or I was watching Rise of Skywalker. All these movies, the things that are happening in them are just off the charts, insane. They're not happening in real space. They're not really they're not really happening. Mm-hmm. So. I think more recently, live action film has hewed a little closer to animated film, whereas animated film and television, I think I think has grown in terms of it's grown its audience into a more, you know, it includes older people. It used to be thought of as just sort of a younger set. And I think there's some more acceptance and push into older audiences. So I think animation has grown in that way, and I think live action has kind of encroached a little bit on the animated space. Encroached, it's not like, you know, bad in a bad way. I just mean there's like a Venn diagram there of things that can be achieved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the types of stories that are done in live action are becoming more tonally similar to the animated films and what they're being able to show and doing things like that. Yeah, I totally get where you're coming from with that.
Yeah.
So I know you dreamed of being a skipper in the parks when you were young, and your mom did Disney trivia with you. You've described yourself as a big Disney nerd who even was friends with characters in the parks. Why did Disney mean so much to you growing up? And could you talk about the moments where you were solidified as a lifelong fan?
Yeah. So, wow, you did your research. Yeah, I mean, my mom, we had this like video store down the street from us, and a small movie theater in town. I grew up in New York on Long Island, and the movie theater really just played like more family movies or whatever. You wouldn't really see like a horror movie in there or anything. And so anytime there was a Disney, at the time they would re-release them out of the vault. You know, there wasn't what there is. There weren't even before videos were really a thing. They were re-releasing them like once a year or something. A classic would come out, so we'd go see that, or I'd rent movies, and or I'd rent the cartoons, and that was just my entertainment. That's what I watched all the time. And then my mom, like every Sunday morning, we would do Disney trivia over breakfast, and I had to. Before we went to the parks, my first trip to the parks was when I was 6, and I had to know before I got there. She quizzed me on like what every single like shop and ride would be on Main Street, and I had to like know it in my head, and I knew all this other stuff, and it was just like it was just something that I loved, and I also loved being good at it for her because she loved it. Mm-hmm. And then yeah, when we went for my 6th birthday, and there was this show that I loved called Welcome to Pooh Corner, and it was like a live action Winnie the Pooh show, and I watched that all the time, and I loved the Winnie the Pooh movie and stuff. And so on my 6th birthday, they got me this Tigger stuffed animal, and we went to the parks for the first time. Got there before the park opened, and the characters were just sort of walking around outside, and Tigger was there, and I had a stuffed Tigger, and Tigger was my favorite character, and I ran up to him and I showed it to him, and he like bounced up and down. And again, park was not open yet, and it wasn't like it is now where there's like a queue and there's like a million people. It was like a little bit more laid back, and they just sort of mill about. And he jumped up and down, took me by the hand, and took me into the park, and we like bounced down Main Street, just me and him. And like my parents were like, "Where is he?" and I spent the rest of the trip, and arguably the rest of my life, obsessed with Tigger, and that was just the most magical moment to me, because you know it doesn't get realer than that. You know, I mean, a character just taking you by the hand and hanging out with you and having fun, and I've never forgotten how much those characters can delight kids and adults. I mean, when you can see it in their eyes when they like go to the parks, or when I'm watching the movies, or the cartoons or whatever, how you forget that these characters are artificial things they're not even like an actor that you could go meet. They're this artificial thing that's just kind of out of somebody's imagination, but the fact that they can like touch your heart like that. And so I've just like that was sort of what solidified that event, I would say, is what solidified me as like a pure Disney fanatic. Mm-hmm. And again, at the time, like that was 1986. So like there wasn't the access of Disney stuff that you have today. Where, I mean, not naturally no internet. There wasn't a Disney store. There wasn't any of that. So like finding Tigger merchandise or Disney merchandise was like a little harder. And so anytime I found it, I would get it, you know. And yeah, and so when I was a kid, I just kind of imagined like, man, I'd love to like live. My mom worked at a job so we could go to Disney World once a year. And that's all I got was like 6 or 7 days a year. Not every year, but about every like we'd go like maybe 1 or 2 years in a row, and then we have to skip a year because it was expensive. But I always, when I was a kid, just thought like, wow, I'd love to live here. I'd love to, you know, work for this. And you know, you don't understand that somebody writes the movies or anything like that. I didn't quite get that, so I wanted to be a Jungle Cruise skipper because I was like, they're here. I want to be them, and they're funny. And then when I was in college, I got to do the Disney College program, where they send recruiters around to the college campuses, and you get to go work for a semester or at the time it was a summer. And I heard about that, and I freaked out because I was like, I have to do this. And I showed up to the interview in a Tigger tie with a Tigger pen, a Tigger folder, and they have like a little presentation, and there were all these different roles. And after the presentation, I guess I did a good job because they asked me to do a job that wasn't even on the list, which was to be friends with the characters. And at the time, they I guess didn't have college students do that, and so I said yes, and so I got to go down there my junior year, or was it junior? Yeah, junior year, or sophomore year. It was my sophomore year, and in the summer, and that kind of became my summer job, was just working in the park. So I'd go down from New York and live in Florida for the summer, and work as a friend of Tigger or Goofy or Genie or Green Army Man and all them. And then, yeah. So that was my first work experience, and like realizing that you could, you know, this company had a lot, you know, had roles that you could do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's something that I've always kind of felt like too, having a close relationship with the parks and the movies and feeling shaped by a lot of those stories and experiences, is I always clamored to come up with a way that I would be able to shimmy my way in. And it's always something that I like have strived to do and been trying to figure out, but that was so cool to hear about how you kind of were able to transition into it and take this opportunity to go and be involved with the parks. And it's cool because I've heard a lot of other, like the big animators who go on to direct these films often all start out going to the parks and working in the parks. So you got to make your impact, you know, influencing people's experiences early on into your life.
Yeah, no, it was super cool. I mean, it's one of those things where it doesn't like, I can't quite, aside from my passion for the Disney company and the Disney characters and sort of what the company is as a whole and what it means to me as a fan and an artist, it's not completely connected. Like, it's not like, oh, I did the college program and then I went and became a writer. Like, it doesn't. Those two things are sort of like far apart in a way.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't like I went down there and I was like, oh, I did this, and because I remember like when I was down there and I was on the Bancroft Brothers podcast, and I brought this up that like I think it was Tom Bancroft, who animated Mushu, he spoke to they had speakers when you're on the college program, and he came in and at the time there was an animation studio in the Florida parks, mm-hmm. and I worked in at the time Disney MGM Studios, now Hollywood Studios, and the real studio was like behind the park. And I was always like, how do I get in there? How do I get in there? How do I meet them? And I remember he came in and like spoke to people, and I thought like, man, how do I ask, like, can I shadow? And somebody else asked, how do I shadow? And they were like, you can't. And I was like, so it's sort of like there was this like weird wall up where I was like, I want to get over there, but I don't know how to do that. but yeah, I think that's in terms of just sort of like laying the foundation for what I always wanted to be a part of that side. I just didn't know how to, but I think one of the things that makes me a strong animation writer and a strong writer, especially for Disney, is that I have a crazy heart for it. And I was raised on it, and I don't know how unique that makes me, because except that I would say most, like, it's not like there's a qualification, like when you check the box, like, do they go like, how much do you love Disney before whether or not they'll hire you? You know what I mean? Like, there are some people who it's just another company to them, and then there are some people who it's they're nuts about it, like I am. So, but that definitely like laid the foundation for me to be to gravitate towards this and like kind of aim towards Disney.
Sure. Yeah, it was you had the desire to make an impact on this company and be able to push that mission forward that they had out, but you didn't know how you were going to be a part of it. And that's how you eventually discovered that you would be able to do that through writing. So could you talk about what steps you took to become a professional writer? And specifically, could you talk about transitioning from college to starting out in stand-up comedy?
Yeah. And then again, this is sort of separate from, it's like sort of two paths that eventually merged, So as a kid, I would create my own, draw and create my own characters, and I'd write stories about them. I'd draw comic books. I was super into comics and movies and everything as a kid. And so I was just always writing stories and things like that, and you kind of don't know what to do with it. And then in high school, I formed like a sketch comedy group, and in college, I continued that, and I formed a sketch comedy group there, and I did stand-up while I was in college. I did sketch comedy while I was in college, and the group of artists and people that I became friends with in college, we all moved down to New York City. I went to college at SUNY Albany, and in the capital region of New York. And then we went down to Brooklyn, because a lot of us were from the greater New York City area. But I basically worked in sketch comedy and stand-up comedy. And while I was in college as well, one of my professors encouraged me to write movies and TV and stuff. So it was one of those things where people were like, oh, you should do that. And so I just kind of started writing things on my own and finding scripts to see what they looked like. Even though I majored in writing in college, I didn't go to a school I didn't go to like a UCLA or an NYU where they have a specific film writing program. So I had to kind of find a lot of that stuff on my own. And I think that I built up most of my skills in sketch comedy, because you're creating characters and situations and a conflict and a kind of a miniature story, and then solve in a very short, quick amount of time when you're doing sketch comedy. And so the transition from college was kind of, college provides you with a space to write and a space to perform, because there's clubs and there's other kids that are interested, and there's you can rent out theaters and you can do things. So I had to kind of figure out, how do I do this in the real world? The stand-up was a little bit easier, because I knew some people from doing stand-up in Albany that knew people in New York, so that helped me get into clubs there. And then sketch comedy was a lot harder, because we had to just sort of find theaters, and I'd have to just write a show, and then we'd have to market it and get people to show up. And for basically like 2 or 3 years, I just did that. I was producing my own sketch shows with them, and then eventually those things became profitable to a degree. And also redirect me if I'm going off the rails, because if I'm getting too specific. But But yeah, the transition was just sort of like trying to find a way to perform and write. And then like I still had absolutely no clue about like breaking into anything. I was just sort of like finding a way to write and perform and make myself better, because there, in my opinion, there's no better teacher than the live audience. Because if I write a joke or something, it's not like when I show it to my mom and she says it's great. It's like the audience laughs or they don't laugh,
Mm-hmm.
Or they're entertained or they're not entertained. They're drifting or they're not. They're with you or they're not. And so you kind of learn really when you write that much stuff. I was writing like an hour and a half show every month and performing it in front of the audience, and you do that for long enough and you kind of develop a gut for it. But eventually I kind of burned myself out. I was writing a bunch of different things, but I didn't really know where to send them. I didn't know what to do. And my now wife, at the time girlfriend, was living in Florida. Her family had moved down there. And so I got engaged and I quit. And I moved down to Florida, and I taught at an art school. Like I taught creative writing at an art school for like 2 years. And I essentially just completely gave up. I was like, I'm burnt out. I went down for like 6 months. I didn't write anything. And it wasn't like a bitter thing. It was just like a tired, I don't know where I'm going. I've been lost in the woods for so long.
Yeah, that sounds really stressful to experience. I can imagine that you'd get out pretty burned out trying to survive in New York City for so long.
Yeah. And you're poor. It's expensive and you're poor. Like, I remember I was so poor that I don't know if poor is a PC term, but I had no money. And, like I had enough. I basically I was making, because when you're doing that, it's like I don't know, I was making enough money to get by to pay my rent, but sometimes I wasn't. And, sometimes it was slower, and sometimes, one show doesn't do as well as the other or whatever. So, but I remember like one time I got like terrible food poisoning because I couldn't afford food, and the only thing I had was like year-old shrimp in the back of the freezer. And like it's stuff like that I was just like, oh, I'm just tired of struggling, and I just quit.
Mm-hmm.
And it just made sense. I was like, oh wow, I can, rather than struggle here in like and not be able to like afford heat in my apartment, I could just move down to Florida where you don't need heat, and I'll live 5 minutes from Disney World, and I can have this job that like pays me a salary and health insurance, and I can like marry my girlfriend, and I can, have like a normal life,
Sure.
And having a normal life, like, where I can like buy an annual pass and just be right by Disney World, and like that'll be cool. Like, it just sort of felt like not, and I can also teach writing, so that's not bad. Like I love sharing knowledge and stuff like that, and so it didn't really feel like a bad deal. I did that for a couple of years. I did that for a few months, not writing anything, and then I kind of caught the bug again, and I wrote a pilot, and I submitted it to a contest, the Slam Dance teleplay contest, and out of like I don't know how many entries, but it was like a couple of thousand. I was a finalist, and it was the first TV pilot I'd ever written, and it got optioned, and it never went anywhere or turned into anything, but it just sort of like gave me that spark to be like, oh man, I miss that. I miss that. I miss writing something funny and fun. And then, so I started doing it again, and then I found a small studio, again, bringing back that there used to be a Disney studio in Orlando. That shut down, and a bunch of small studios opened, and I got hired into one of these small studios, and because my wife found it and was like, you should send your stuff there, and I did, and they hired me, and so I went in and I was writing. All of a sudden I found myself writing an animated series, and I worked with this incredible team. The guy who ran it was a former Disney supervising animator. I mean, he was like trained by the 9 Old Men, so I got all these really cool Walt Disney, like behind the scenes Walt stories that he would tell us, and
Mm-hmm.
It was super inspiring. And then my team was incredible, and they've all gone on to like one of my best friends that I worked with there, who would actually eventually kind of be my foot in the door at Disney, was this guy Tim Moen, who he's right now he's the lead character designer on DuckTales. But at the time, he was just a kid from Long Island, and this was his first job in a studio, and this was my first job in a studio. And we worked together, and we became really good friends. And our whole team was just, I mean, everybody's gone on to do something pretty cool at, like, whether it's like at Lucasfilm or at Blue, we have a bunch of them at Blue Sky and stuff like that. But we worked at that studio for a couple of years, and it seemed like everything was great. And then that studio, well, I don't know if I'm pushing beyond. You said to concentrate on going from college to the real world.
Yeah.
And that's college to the real world. That's what.
Oh, and that's fine. Like that's where I was going next, was wondering about what your time was like at 3DH Entertainment and how that helped prepare you to start off writing for animation and how that all kind of came to be. So it was absolutely fine where you were going in your story.
Cool. Oh, so you want me to talk about 3DH?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, well, 3DH, it was just this little studio in Celebration, Florida. If people that are listening are not familiar with what Celebration is, I'm sure you know what it is. Mm-hmm. But it's a small town that was developed, like a kind of a planned community developed by Disney. And it's just south of the parks, and it looks kind of like Pleasantville. I mean, it's like a perfect little town, and it's actually, fun fact, like closer to what Walt's original vision of Epcot was than what Epcot the park is, because he actually envisioned a community, experimental prototype community of tomorrow. He envisioned like a planned community, whereas Epcot, you know, they sort of took the community and made it into like a community of nations and things like that. But anyway, that's I digress. Disney nerd popping out. But yeah, so it was just this small studio, and they were making a series of 3D animated shows called Bug Eyes, and everything was made in-house. And at first they were on the 5th floor of this building, which is now actually occupied by Imagineering in Florida. And it was just 2 rooms, really, really tiny. And it was just me, Tim, who would do kind of a little bit of boarding and character design work. Jeffrey, who is the guy who ran the studio. Aaron, who is our head of story. Ty did our like backgrounds and some boarding as well, and he came from Nickelodeon. And it was just this really tight little group of people working on this little project, and it was fun. 3DH was funded by a digital imaging company, so it was just kind of the entertainment wing of a digital imaging company. And we were just working on these episodes for a few years, and everybody was really close and really tight, but because, you know, independent ventures are finite in their money, they're not like a Disney company, it sort of just shut down suddenly. So we had I had written an entire series, and a few episodes have been released in, I think, Australia or something like that, but for the most part everything was just like boarded and recorded and made into animatics and stuff, and then we closed before we could complete the series, which is heartbreaking because it was incredible. Like, it was, for an independent studio, it was incredible stuff. But it shut down, and then we were all kind of out, and it was scary because Florida isn't a town that's got a lot of film going on. So everybody kind of spread out and went and did their own thing, and so that after that, like and at the time we were also developing a feature, and this is kind of what led me to Disney eventually. But we were developing a feature, and when the studio closed, the company that was co-producing it bought that away from the studio, and they hired me to do that. And so I was working on that for a while, but then they ran out of funding. But during that time, they brought on a producer, this guy, Max Howard, who is one of my greatest friends and probably the person who got me. I basically owe him my career. When that feature ran out of money, he just really believed in me, and he really believed in my writing and liked working with me. And so he would recommend me, like, anytime he ran into a project that he found needed work, he would recommend me to stuff, and that kind of shot me into stuff outside of Florida, let's say.
Sure. Yeah, because I had seen that you had a lot of different experiences on your way to Walt Disney Television Animation. So he was kind of the link between all of those different projects for you?
Yes. Yeah. So I remember there were a couple of things that he was working on that I helped him out on, and they were things that were kind of searching for funding but weren't quite there. And then, and during this time, I was just like, for me, it was just struggling. Like, I was writing anything I could, doing anything I could to make ends meet. My wife and I had, our first couple, we had a couple of kids. So it was like, you have to put food on the table more than you have to chase your dream. So you're doing, whatever you can to survive and keep the roof over your head. And so my wife's a teacher. She was teaching, and I was taking like any kind of freelance and any kind of like little job here and there that I could. And then I remember he recommended me to this project. There's a film that was being made in Israel. And like, one thing that people don't understand about when you're working on stuff is that when you're a writer, is a lot of times things just don't come out. So you'll get paid to do something, but then like you're the first step in a long road to production. So like, that movie may never come out, So I'd start getting like little things. Like the first thing that I remember, we were like only making ends meet. And I know this, I'm kind of mentioning sort of like the suffering aspect a lot, just because it's like, this is a dream following podcast.
Yeah.
And it's like, there was no like, oh, I just went to New York and then I started writing and then boom, Disney. Like, that does not that didn't happen. This is like, there's like a 10-year gap of like little successes. Like 3DH was like a 2-year I didn't get paid a lot, but it was just fun. We were just working on these beautiful little episodes, and they were great. And then that ended. It's like, and you find yourself struggling again. And I remember we were only making ends meet because the bills were due like the first week of the next month, Mm-hmm. And then I remember this project came my way through Max, that they were making. It was like an animated film in Israel, and they asked for my samples, and they asked for and it seemed like I had a shot at it, except I was up against one of the people who wrote Madagascar. Oh. And I was like, and I remember like, I didn't get it because I didn't write Madagascar. And I was like, of course I didn't. Like, that movie made $500 million, and I had I had a TV series that never came out, and like a pretty good spec screenplay that I'd written, and they said they liked it, but it's like, I didn't write Madagascar. And I remember like being actually kind of happy about that, because I was like, wow, well, at least I'm getting, at least the person that beat me wrote Madagascar, and it's not just some guy down the street. So, and then 6 months later, they called me again, and I guess the guy, I'm not going to say the name, but like, basically like, things didn't work out with that person. And, I'm not saying they didn't do good work. It's just like, for whatever reason, sometimes that happens. And, they made me an offer to come onto the movie. And I remember like walking in, and like my wife was like holding our daughter, and I was just like, I just told her like how much I made how much money I was going to make that week, which isn't like the hugest amount of money in the world, but like to us at the time, it was like life changing. Mm-hmm. And I just like said how much it was, and I just like walked out of the room, like, and went and like just like sat down at the kitchen table, like, I don't know, it was just this really huge really like kind of validating moment of like, whoa, like I just sort of came out of the tunnel. And from there, projects just kind of went from like one thing to the next thing to the next thing. Because like right after I wrote that movie, which never came out, by the way, right after I wrote that movie, I remember I was like finishing it up, and I was like, oh no, what comes next? And then I got a call about Saving Santa, and their writer was like, the writer they had hired for it was late or something, and like wasn't going to be able to start on time. And they basically had 3 weeks until they needed a production ready script. And I said yes, which is crazy because 3 weeks to write a feature script is crazy. And I remember I wrote the first draft in like 17 days, and it did really, like, they loved it. And then they ended up getting a bigger investment because of it, and they got Martin Freeman signed on based on the draft, and like there was just like it was just like a lot of momentum. And that movie was so far into production that like it got, I mean, the movie just, like, I wrote it and it was being made like as soon as I finished it, and I was like, oh wow. And then that movie, because that, you know, there's sort of different levels of, I don't want to say levels because I don't want to say like better than, but in terms of like your credibility in the industry, it's like, if you think of it as like a pyramid of people, it's like they're on the bottom of the pyramid. You've got people who like say they're a writer, but like they're working on like one script, or they've maybe written one script, but like, and then like above that are like the people who are like always writing scripts, and they've got like a lot of scripts and stuff like that, but they still haven't been, you know, worked or whatever. And then there's ones who've been like, who've been paid, you know, but they've not had anything come out. And then once you have something come out, that kind of gives you like a little bit more street credibility.
Sure.
And you know, it takes years and years to struggle through those levels. But then when that was coming out, that got me some meetings in LA, and what basically made me like a little bit more appetizing appetizing is maybe the wrong word, but
yeah, you were more established going into the workforce now of writers in animation, now that something had actually went through the entire production process. And that was something I didn't even realize before speaking to you, is how often you're involved in projects that don't fully pan out. That was something that I didn't even think about.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff. I mean, especially working for Disney now, like, I mean, I've written things for Disney that will never see, I mean, on Tangled, there's whole episodes I've written that will never see the light of day. And there's shows that I've helped, you know, work on in development that will never see the light of day. And there are, you know, there's things that they're working on right now. I mean, they've got, you know, all these different projects and things like that. There's so much more stuff gets not made than made, you know? So, and there are a lot of people who make a really good living off of things that nobody ever sees. So it's like, it's strange.
And are all those things projects that you're like not allowed to talk about anymore? Do you have to sign NDAs for all of these different ideas just in case they want to pull them back? Or how does that work?
Yeah. When you, especially like with Disney, you know, you're not allowed to talk about like what things you've touched or not touched, you know? So, but yeah, I mean, like, and I haven't done like tons and tons of stuff for Disney development, but like there've been a couple of projects that they've brought me in on to work on, and it was pretty exciting. And then, you know, yeah, I'm afraid to talk about them because I don't want Mickey to come show up in my house in the middle of the night and be like, Roxburgh, Karen, you know.
Completely understandable.
Yeah. I don't know where I should go now.
The next thing that I wanted to talk to you about was how you transitioned from going through on all of these projects and being involved in starting to transition into LA more work and making that transition into working for Disney directly, and how that all began with working on Tangled the series.
Okay, so I was working, I made Saving Santa, and I was also, Saving Santa did not pay me a lot of money, but what I was doing was I was basically writing like these independent, like I was writing these little like independent movies here and there. I'd get about 1 or 2 a year, and I was also teaching in a master's program in like an online master's program, and the online teaching thing gave me kind of a consistent salary, so I wasn't like freaking out about money all the time. And it also gave me a really flexible schedule. And so what I was doing was, since I had Saving Santa coming out, I had a little bit of like I said, like street cred in that sense. Not that people are like, oh wow, Saving Santa, but it was like, it's a $10 million movie and it's coming out with the Weinstein Company, which Weinstein wasn't such a dirty word at the time. So what I would do is, I was still living in Orlando, Florida. I was living right behind Disney World, and Saving Santa actually was written I wrote it at the Wilderness Lodge. That's where I would go every day and sit in the Wilderness Lodge lobby and write there, which is fun.
Yeah, that's really cool.
And I still do that, by the way. I'll still, like, if I'm writing, like, I've written a couple, like, not the whole episode because it takes too long, but like I'd drive down to Disneyland and like write at California, like the Grand Californian or something like that. I still love doing that. Or at the train station, I've written Disneyland. So, but like I was basically, I'd fly out to LA, stay with some friends on their, like, and kind of take meetings for a couple of weeks and then fly back to Florida. And I was just doing that for a while. And then I ended up getting a meeting on Dragons, the DreamWorks series, and they agreed to give me a freelance episode. So I was pumped because I love How to Train Your Dragon. But the way freelance works typically is it's just kind of emails and phone calls. So they'll say like, oh hey, like send us some episode ideas, or they'll approve one and tell you to go write that, or they'll give you they'll say go write the one where Toothless does this or something like that. But I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to just be in Florida. I wanted to learn. I'm always eager to learn the process and learn from the people who are better than me and know more than me. So I asked if I could write it or at least break it in the room with them, with the writers, and they said yes. So I flew out to LA and I stayed with some friends, and I went into the Dragons writers room, and I met the Dragons writers are phenomenal. Really, they're still friends to this day, and worked on the episode with them. And then while I was there, as I mentioned, my friend Tim from 3DH, he was working on a show called 10-0 at Disney Television Animation. And I went and met him for lunch on my last day there. And he was like, oh, hey, he's like, would you want to meet this guy, Shane Prigmore? He worked on the How to Train Your Dragon feature and like helped design like Hiccup and stuff like that. So I was like, sure. So we went to meet him, and he was in this room, just a small, like, kind of unassuming office with this other guy, Chris Sonnenberg. And we just started chatting, and it was just supposed to be like a handshake. Like, I swear to God, I did not know that they were doing a Tangled show. I didn't know anything like that. And I was just kind of there to say hello. And we kind of got on Frozen, and I was sort of I have a tendency to rant sometimes, and I kind of expressed it's not that I don't like Frozen, it's that I didn't like that Frozen gets all this credit for being great when Tangled's a better movie, but Frozen just made more money, in my opinion. And I kind of broke down why Tangled's a superior movie, like structurally and just sort of, entertainment wise and all this stuff. And they were just sort of like looking at me weird. And then when I was done, they were like, do you know that we're making a Tangled show? And I was like, I did not know that. And I really didn't know that, but I like flipped out. I was like, that's so cool. And then they were like, when are you done with dragons? And I'm like, I'm freelancing. So right now, and they were like, can you send us your stuff? So I sent them my samples, and then a couple of weeks later, and it was so funny, like I so didn't expect there to be any chance of me ever getting this that I like hem and haw before I send my samples. I just sent them right in, and then they emailed me a few weeks later and asked me if I would be willing to move to California, and I said yes. And there was like a little bit of a testing period, but then I remember on like right before Christmas, they officially told me that I was staffed on Tangled, and then I moved out. I drove out New Year's Day of 2015.
Wow.
Yeah.
Man, after struggling for so long and climbing the ranks and paying your dues, that must have been an incredible feeling, especially after just kind of stumbling upon, having this connection with the creators of this show. That's just wild to think about.
Yeah. And it's funny. It's like, it's weird. Like, some people say like, oh, it's like, it's who you know, or it's, it's luck, or it's, it's this or that. It's like, I don't know. My parents, my dad was an accountant. My mom worked at a nonprofit. Like, I didn't know anybody. Like, my connections were made just from working and kind of stumbling around in the dark and meeting people. Like, when I met Tim, I wasn't like, oh, I'm going to talk to this guy. One day he's going to walk, like, he was just a goofball that we get burritos at lunch with, and and joke around, and we both shared kind of a fellow, we were both fellow Disney nerds and stuff. And that kind of put me in the right place, several years later, put me in the right place at the right time. And then all the hard work that I'd done, when they asked for the samples, I had samples that were good enough to get me over there. And yeah, and it was a scary time too, because like during the test, there was like a month of testing, and I had to write a test script for Tangled. And it was scary because I was like, I remember calling my wife I was in like Whole Foods in Hollywood, and I was getting dinner, and I was like, I don't know if I don't get this, I don't know what I'm going to do, because I'm so close.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be like I didn't know how I would get this close to where I'm actually working in the studio. I'm here and I can touch it. And like, if they don't hire me, I don't know how, and I still don't, I don't know how I would have reacted, because I did get it, but, yeah, but it was like, even when I was that close, I was like, there's still, and then getting the official word was pretty huge.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
At that point, when you were writing the potential scripts to show off your talent, was the whole idea of the show solidified? Were you already writing for a lot of the new characters?
When I started, they had the larger beats of the series. Mm-hmm. So what I remember is like, there were like little visual beats up on, there's like you've probably seen them in the big cork boards where they they'll have like concept art, and there were tons of different concepts of kinds of adventures that they might go on that Shane had drawn, and there were little beats of what might happen throughout the series, and what might happen in the pilot. And in particular, like there's even shots that are in the pilot that like, there's like touching the black rocks, the hair growing back while she's riding riding back toward the kingdom, the sort of the hair reveal at the coronation and all that stuff. Those things were there. The idea, and I remember like the final shots. I'd actually have to think about how they compare with the finale, but just the idea of like Zontiri wasn't a thing at the time, but how it all ended was. Does that make sense? Like sort of like reuniting the sun drop and the moonstone, like all that was there. The idea of season 1 being an acclamation of to Corona, season 2 being out on the road and like going and discovering the moonstone and stuff like that was there. I don't really remember quite if there was. I don't really remember very much about what season 3 would be. in that sense, but the overall beats of the story were there.
Yeah.
Like the larger story. Varian was a name on a board. He wasn't fully established. I remember like one of the things I did in testing was I wrote like an outline of an episode with Varian, and it was actually really similar. It was like the head writer at the time was a different head writer than Jace, and he left before the show started. He was like, take a stab at something that's like late in season 1. So I actually wrote like an outline of an episode that was like Varian as a bad guy, but like he had control, like basically using his alchemy, he had control of the rocks, and it was very similar to like Cassandra's revenge in the sense that like he was sort of using the room to fight. So, but that was just sort of that was sort of exploratory. It wasn't like, oh, this was planned. It was just sort of like use your imagination and see what you come up with. So that wasn't like Chris saying like, oh, that's what's going to happen. You know what I mean? It was just sort of like play and have fun. And then yeah. And I also had to write, like, we had to just pitch episodes, and there were some episodes that were planned that eventually came to fruition, and there's a bunch that kind of fell away. And then I did my test script, which was a lot of fun. It was my test script was called Joust the Two of Us, and it was about basically the king was looking forward to like hanging out with Rapunzel and like, daddy daughter day out, and then it was sort of like Father of the Bride in the way, like in a way, like he realizes like not only is she grown up, basically overnight to him in a way, because she shows up and she's grown up, but now she's got this fiance that takes up all of her or not fiance, but boyfriend that takes up all of her time, and he's kind of jealous. So he gets kind of competitive with Eugene for Rapunzel's time. Yeah, it was a sweet, kind of funny story, but doesn't but it was, again, it was just for test purposes. It was just like, can you write the voice of the characters? Can you execute a story and things like that?
Yeah. So once you got into that position of becoming a staff writer, what did your day-to-day become? And what's the difference between having the credit for writing an episode versus being a staff writer on an episode?
Okay. Well, the day-to-day was basically we'd come in, and there were 3 other, well, actually for the first like 6 months, it was just me and Dave Schiff. We were shorthanded, and Jace was our story editor, which is like the head writer. And then there was Dave, who was our, the other staff writer. And then at the time they were still hunting for more writers, because the writers that were testing with me didn't pan out. And so they were still hunting for writers, and they particularly wanted, so until they found the right writers, we were shorthanded. But basically we'd come in and we'd just we'd pitch on episode ideas. And there was like we had a little bit of time, not too much time, but like a little bit of time before we could start. We had to start writing on that first script. Jace was working on the pilot, and so we just kind of, we call it blue skying, where you just sort of write down episode ideas and you write like sort of beginning, middle, and end and what the episode might be, and come up with a bunch of things. And we also talked about what the overall arc of the series overall arc of the season might be. And we'd pick like the ideas that we liked the most and kind of put them where in the season they would fall. And then once it became time for like scripts or whatever, day to day is basically you come in, say, okay, we're going to break Ricky's story today. We all go into the story room, and we know what episode we're going to break, whatever episode we're going to break. So like, let's say it's, I don't know, like Great Exploitations. We all go in, we have the basic idea of what the story is, and we just kind of talk it out, and we have like a big Word document up on the board, and we have bullet points, and we talk out the story, and we talk out different iterations of what it could be and what's happening. And it takes a while, and sometimes it'll take a few days. Sometimes they go faster than others, but it'll just be like kind of days of that. And then once it's broken, we would go away and write what's called a premise. And that I would do on my own, so you're not doing that in the room. And the premise is kind of like a 4 or 5 page like prose document of what the story is.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not worrying about dialogue. It's not worrying about like the specific action, like of the actions. It's more like what the emotional story is and like what the character's going through, so we know like where their headspace is and all that. And then that will go, once that's done, that gets sent in for approval. I get notes from Jace. I might make some adjustments. Then it gets sent to the executives, and it gets sent to Chris and everything, and they'll give notes and stuff. And then once that gets approved, then it goes to outline, and you write the outline's kind of like a script, but without the words. I mean, without the words, without the dialogue. Sorry, or very little. Naturally, it has lots of words, and then sort of the same thing. Like you know, if you're working on that on your own for a few weeks, so the day to day is literally like you come in and you might just be sitting in your office writing, or the way I am, I sort of wander around the studio and lay on couches and stuff. Or, you know, sometimes you can even write from home or a coffee shop or something, but like it's just sort of taking that time to write that episode. Goes in for notes, then you get approved, and you go to script and sort of repeat. And in between there, sometimes you'll get called in for a meeting to help break another story, because while you are doing that, other stories are being broken and other writers are being launched on those things. So they sort of overlap. So they're all coming in one after the other. So that's kind of the day-to-day, is just sort of like story meetings where you talk about episodes, you're breaking episodes, and then there's also sometimes like punch meetings where you come in and just sort of punch up scripts or go over the script and see if there's more jokes that can be made or ways to improve scripts and stuff. But it's just kind of meetings and script writing. So you're either on your own writing, or you're in a meeting talking about your episode or somebody else's episode.
Yeah, you're all kind of building the story as a group, but taking on certain episodes on your own to flesh out.
Yeah, and the episodes that are picked are basically like, well, where are we in the season? Where's Rapunzel and Eugene? Where, like, for example, like the way Varian's arc was constructed in season 1 was like we knew that we'd meet him in the first regular episode, and we'd meet him as a friend. And then we wanted to meet him again in between the mid-season so that we'd get, you know, kind of a better sense of him and who he is and like what he wants. And then we knew in the mid-season he'd suffer a tragedy and take a turn for the worse. And then we knew that, and I always think of it as like columns, like if you picture like a Greek building or something, you know, with columns or whatever holding up a thing, like the overall arc of the story is sort of like, not every single episode isn't one leading into the other, but those big columns, like the stories that take place in between those columns, the standalone episodes, like they have to fit within like where the characters are at that moment. So even though they're not necessarily contributing to the arc of the plot specifically, they are contributing to the character and kind of like fleshing out like where the character is at that moment. So where Rapunzel is specifically.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're pitching on episodes, you're like, okay, well, we have to do 3 episodes, you know, in between Varian turning bad and Queen for a Day or whatever, and like Varian showing up again. So what's going on during that time? How's Rapunzel feeling? Well, you know, her spirit's kind of broken. She had this really difficult choice to make. So we're going to, you know, painter's block comes out of being afraid to make a decision, you know, because she had this really hard decision. Now she's sort of frightened off of that, you know, so that like finding a story that fits that way.
When you're writing these stories, is it difficult to write for all of these different characters and try to line up what other people are writing for them as well? Or is it easier when you're working in a community way that you're able to feed off of the other thoughts and tones and writing styles of other people around you?
You're in the room with them, with everybody so much, and you all know what is going on with the characters, and after you write, like, I'd say like an episode or 2, you're so in tune, or, you know, or because even by the time you've written one, you've read several, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody's pretty in tune with who they are, and then there's, you know, you've got Jace and Chris, you know, above you to kind of govern what they believe. You know, they're sort of they were like a filter of like, no, like Rapunzel wouldn't say something like that, or Rapunzel. So after a while, you kind of like know where their minds are at with the characters, so you sort of know the lines to color within. And after a while, you don't even think about how they would react. You just know, like, you just sort of, it's like a real person that you know, and you just know how Rapunzel would react to something. You know how you know what they would say, so you just sort of hear it in your head, you know.
Sure. Yeah. After looking at these characters so much, you're much closer to them than before when you just had seen the original movie.
Yeah. I mean, you literally spend 8 hours a day thinking about these characters specifically, you know, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, or if you're like me, 7 days a week, like, you know, but you're just thinking about them all the time, and you're thinking about what they would do, what they wouldn't do, where they would go, how to basically, what's a problem that you can put in front of them, and how do you get them out of that problem in a creative way, and like, how would they approach that problem, and how would Eugene approach that problem, and how would, you know, and how would Pascal approach that? So you're just sort of, yeah, it just becomes second nature after a while.
So how did it feel to begin to make an impact in the world of Tangled? And is there anything specific that you feel you helped flesh out specifically? Like, was there something that you felt you made the biggest impact on?
I mean, it felt amazing because, I mean, kind of going back to like where I was before, like I have an immense respect for the Disney company and the characters, and Tangled's one of my favorite animated films of all time. And so just going in, I had a tremendous respect for it and reverence for it. So to me, like, working for Disney is like if you're playing baseball and you play for the Yankees. You know, it's like there's no other company where you're like, oh, hey, I'm going to see a Disney movie. Like, that's the only company you can say that about. You can't say, like, no one's like, I'm going to see the new Universal movie. Like, nobody knows what that is, you know. Mm-hmm. But like Disney, just, it means like a little bit something more. So knowing that I was writing something that builds on characters, because, you know, you go to the parks and you see these kids that are, you know, wearing the Rapunzel dress, and you see, you know, like, there's the online communities of people that love these characters. So it's not, and being a fan of things myself, like, you know, I've been in the shoes of those people that, like, you know, I've been in the shoes of the fan that, like, you know, characters you love be taken in a direction that you hate, you know, and, or doing, you know, kind of doing something that you're like, they wouldn't do that. Why are they doing that? You know, so that was always kind of in the back of my mind. And the crew, there were so many fans on the crew, and everybody was, I don't want to say everybody, but so many people in the crew were in that space. So I definitely don't want to, like, take credit for, like, I did a specific thing.
Sure.
I mean, but there's things like I'm like there's episodes where I'm particularly like the Pascal story, like, I came up with that, you know, like, that was something that I sat down and I wrote that in one sitting, like that story. And so that's very much me. And, like, so I'm like, wow, like, I came up with how Rapunzel met Pascal. Hooray. You know, like, it's things like, or like knocking down the tower, like that, like, doing that episode, like, I feel very privileged to have been, like, part of those things. Mm-hmm. But they're not, animation is so collaborative, and these stories are so collaborative, and our crew is so phenomenal. And, like, you know, so I don't want to like lean into anything too much and say, like, oh, that's me. 'Cause, like, everybody touches these things and adds just a little bit more. And so I will say, like, I'm very proud. One of the things I loved about this show was that I had the opportunity to, like, I pitched a lot of stories, and a lot of those stories that are there come from my ideas. So I feel, and the crew and the team really like was very collaborative in the way that, like, you know, Chris and Jace and stuff, they were, and the other writers were very open to my ideas, and so, like, when I look at it, I see a lot of me in it, you know. But I wouldn't say there's like a particular thing where I'm like, oh, ha ha ha, like, lucky you guys, I showed up and, you know, that's there, you know.
Sure. There was just times where you got to bring forth an idea that was able to be developed by the entire team.
Yes. Yes, definitely. Lots of them. And then there's, you know, there's, like I said, there's lots of things where, you know, you get to do, somebody else comes up with something and you get to do it. And I mean, to me, like, my individual episodes are very special to me because I always try to find like an emotional place where, like, where it comes from me. So, like, there's a little bit more of me in those ones. And, like, I always say, like, you know, like, I associate happinesses with going to the Disney college program for the first time. Like, that's me being like so excited to go away to live in Disney World. Woohoo! You know, and I'm going to be away from home for the first time. And then about a month in, realizing that I'm homesick and being sad, but I should be having fun because I'm out here doing it. And, like, so it's things like that, like having that connection emotionally, like, those things for me are special because I can watch those episodes kind of in a way that, like, people at home probably aren't watching them, but it feels special in that way.
Yeah, that you embed your experiences and your voice into the language of the characters so that it's something that really resonates with you specifically. That's really cool.
Yeah. And I mean, just being like something like that, like being homesick, is something that everybody will experience at some point, you know, so it's a universal feeling. It's just that for me, that's how like, that memory is how I tap into that episode, you know, like where the episode kind of comes from.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing I've heard is that Cassandra's Revenge is one of your favorite episodes. What makes you so excited about that one specifically? And especially coming from a place where that is one of my favorite episodes that I got to watch. I loved the mid-seasons and the finales of each of the seasons. That one especially was extremely dramatic. So I'd love to hear what your thought process was, what really makes you drawn to that one.
Well, first of all, just the opportunity to write one of the tentpole. Well, I wrote the Rapunzel's Return and that, so I got to write 2 tentpoles. But from the day I got there, I was like, I always want more. You know, I'm like very, like a, you know, I'm not happy unless I'm too busy. And, you know, Jace would write all the tentpole episodes, and I kind of kept nudging him, saying, like, I want to do this, you know, I want to do this, and I want to write one of the big ones. And then season 3, he finally gave me that opportunity. And for Cassandra's Revenge, the reason there's a few reasons I love it, but in particular, like, I wanted to treat it, to me, like, Cassandra's Revenge has, like, everything that's great about the series, and I wanted to put, like, everything, like, just everything about the series into it that I loved. I got a lot of freedom from Jace and Chris on it, and Ben, and I got to kind of come in and pitch what I thought I'd like to see, and they really liked it and ran with it, and expanded upon it. It wasn't like I came in and, like, everything was there, and just the idea of, like, first I thought it was great because it was like, okay, well, this is 2 friends that we had this rift in the beginning of the season, and they're basically 2 freight trains coming at each other, and, like, wow, what's going to happen? You know, the question of what's going to happen when I see that person that I have this fight with again, you know? So that huge conflict was something I was excited about the idea of, like, you know, we destroyed the tower in the first season, and to me, towers are like an iconic part of the Tangled universe. And I was like, wow. So getting to bring that back, that sort of aspect of it back into it, getting to bring Cassandra into the story again instead of having her kind of far away, like bringing her into the fold. I also felt like a lot of our tent poles split Eugene and Rapunzel up a lot, and they were in different places, and I wanted to do one where they were together the whole or most of the time. And so, yeah, I mean, to me, it was just this episode. It's hard to put a finger on it. It's just because it's like one of those things where it's like there's so many things in it that you're excited to do, and as it came together, it just became one of those ones where I was like, wow, it's sort of like this little self-contained movie. Like, it starts off where everything's great, and then here comes the villain, and things start to get scary again, and then they get worse and worse and worse. And I think that episode has some of the best songs, and then that fight at the end, like putting them together and actually having them, go full bore, with their powers, because it was something that one of the other things was that I feel like, Rapunzel is sometimes hopeful and passive to a point where it's like almost frustrating, because you want her to say to Cassandra, like, no, you're wrong. Like I didn't choose this for myself. I didn't do this to you,
Yeah.
And she didn't really get that opportunity, or she wasn't completely listened to in Rapunzel's return. And naturally, they're split up for that time, and it's not like they can call each other on the cell phone or email each other. So to have Rapunzel stand up, and then to just be able to, like, to me, it was exciting to push Rapunzel to her breaking point and say, okay, when will enough be enough? When, like, a good villain will turn the thumb screws on their hero, and how far can Cassandra push Rapunzel before she'll say, you know what, now we're going to fight, and because I really, to me, Rapunzel's strength is that she doesn't, it's that she seeks amicable, she doesn't seek to just punch somebody in the face. She's not, she can kick ass, but like it's her restraint that makes her strong. And so to me, it was a cool thing to be able to like push her into that corner, have this absolutely powerful villain in Cassandra, and Cassandra thinks she's got her on the ropes and thinks that she can squash her, and then show that Rapunzel, just as she did with Gothel, say, no, I'm not going to give up. You're not going to be able to push me around. And so that final fight, and like seeing Rapunzel, that she's got this new power that we've never seen before, and seeing how that clashes with Cassandra and all that. I mean, it was just, I don't know. It was just all very, sorry, I'm gushing, but it's just very like exciting. It was like, to me, it was like a very exciting idea to sort of take this slow burn conflict, and then say, okay, we get to put them in a room together and seal the room, and they're not going to leave. This episode isn't going to turn away, and like some little inconvenient thing is going to happen, and they don't get to fight, or she runs away, or there's like, no, they have to go. Like, Rapunzel's forced to confront her, and like that to me was like the most exciting thing about it.
Sure. I remember Cassandra's Revenge being a title that was, I don't know how it became known, but early, like midway through season 2, it became known that was an episode title that was being developed for season 3. So I remember seeing that even before they got to the Moonstone and the finale of season 2. And so it was all building up to that. I knew that something crazy was going to happen, and something was going to finally develop. And so it was amazing to see it finally happen, and especially happen with such large action against characters that we really cared about, because there was a lot of action throughout the show against a lot of random enemies, but this was finally a villain that really was testing Rapunzel, especially as you were talking about, and the anger and the patience that Rapunzel was dealing with, and finally seeing her fully unleashed. As you described, that you're a fan of Frozen, but Tangled has a special place in your heart, and Elsa's always thought of as the as the most powerful princess, but I felt like in Tangled the series, you finally got to see that no, Rapunzel at the peak of her powers is pretty amazing in and of herself.
Yeah, definitely.
So you've been a part of panels at D23 Expo, you've been on fans podcasts like this one, and you've interacted with a lot of fans online. What has it been like to see people really fall in love with the stories that you've helped write?
I mean, it's just satisfying. It's like because you really like when you're in the studio, you're in this like little footprint of a office building, working on this show, and you talk about what would be cool, and you don't know what anybody's going to think, really. Mm-hmm. You just sort of hope, because it's made, year and a half or more before anybody sees it. I mean, I've worked on 2 different shows since Cassandra's Revenge, since I finished Cassandra's Revenge, or since Flynn Foster's my last episode. So like, since I did that one, I've done 2 shows, and it just aired, So a lot of time has passed, but it's just like one of the best experiences I've ever had was at D23, I was in the audience for when they screened the opening of Pascal's story, and like everybody like laughed and gasped and cried and smiled and everything. Like you can even like watch it on YouTube. Like I every now and then I will, like it like just it was like the most satisfying thing in the world, because normally you don't get to be in the room with people who are experiencing it. Mm-hmm. So that was incredible. You're like, okay, I'm doing it right. And then seeing it online and like getting to interact with the fans and stuff, like the Tangled fans have just been the most generous and sweet and kind and enthusiastic. It was something that I like never thought of going into this, that like, oh wow, like people, you kind of don't get how many people see it, not just in the United States, but around the world, Mm-hmm. So you'll get these messages from people, and they'll ask you questions about it, and like everybody's like, really nice and respectful, and it just feels good to know that, contribute to something that made somebody happy, and that, like, especially if they were a fan of the movie, which I assume most Tangled fans are, of the TV show, were first fans of the movie. Like, if they're enjoying the show, that means a lot, because it's like, I didn't ruin their childhood,
Mm-hmm. For me, I was kind of the opposite, where I really got into the show, and that made me appreciate the movie so much more, that I was like,
oh wow.
It was because there was, for example, Pascal's story was something that I thought of as a Disney fan who loved talking about Disney movies and the backstories of characters on my YouTube channel, that I was like, this is so cool that there's all of this like hidden lore that's being discussed. And that's what got me starting watching the show. And that made me really start to fall in love with the original Tangled movie even more. And so that was kind of my experience with it. And so Tangled the series means probably even more to me than the original movie itself.
Oh wow, that's cool. That's a huge shot in the arm. That's good.
Yeah, I mean that's just where I'm coming from with it. But yeah, Tangled, it's an amazing show. It's probably my favorite, easily my favorite Disney TV show that's ever released, but on the larger scale as well. It's probably one of my favorite Disney stories as well.
Oh, thank you. That's awesome. Yeah. Well, it was, very, like, I would say very, very little of it was taken lightly. Mm-hmm. Nobody stories were broken very much with care. Chris and Ben both cared very deeply about, making sure that the show was in line with like the quality of the movie, and I felt that way. I went into every episode like trying to make it as good as what you would see on the big screen. So yeah, so I'm glad it did the job for you.
you can clearly see that it's a work of passion and not something that's just created to expand the world or tell stories with the characters that people already enjoyed, that it was something that people really cared about and wanted to expand upon, which is clear from the original cast returning and all of the music that was being created and everything. So I thought it came together amazingly. It was a pleasure to be able to see all the way through.
That's awesome. Thanks.
Absolutely. So now that Tangled has come to a close, you've worked on other shows. What was the transition like from this original project that you came and were a part of to moving on to these other shows?
It's strange because like Tangled was my first show, like staff show, and so when you're on being on Tangled, I was on Tangled for almost 4 years, and that's like how long you're in high school, you know, and so you're literally spending every single day with the crew, and I mean, not like you're all in the same room every day, but just like when you're in high school, it's like you see the same people around, you've got the same little like groups of friends, and you know, you all get to know each other, and then and you know, some people leave, and some people, you know, not everybody's there for all the seasons, but for the most part, the crew's pretty much like that. And then as the show winds down, people start leaving, and you start going your separate ways, and you start seeing people less and less, and so it's sort of, there's like a little bit of a feeling of loss, you know, and and sadness, because you're like, oh, like this is like my sort of family away from home, and now they're gone. And then for me, I got, as Tangled was ending, I got an offer to go on to Big Hero 6, which basically, like the way the studio works is like they're inside the building. There's like a building that we work in, and we're all on this floor, and like Tangled, sort of, if you imagine a square, right? Tangled was in the top right hand part of the square, and then in the bottom right hand part of the square was Mickey and the Rose Racers, and in the top left hand part of the square was Big Hero 6. So when I got hired onto that, I stayed on the Tangled floor. I just moved 300 yards or like 100 yards to the left, right? So it was sort of weird because I was like there but not there, and like I'd see people on the crew sometimes, they're like, "You're still here?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm over in Big Hero," you know. So it felt kind of like going from like high school to like community college, where you're like sort of seeing some of the same people, and then just getting adjusted to Big Hero was different, because every show, you would think that like, you know, a studio, you would think that a studio like Disney just says like, okay, this is how we do things, but that's not how it works. Like every show does things a little bit differently and has a little bit different of a process. So the good thing was that I already knew a bunch of people from Big Hero. Han Yi, who was a writer on Tangled, she had left kind of she wasn't on Tangled for too long, because then she went over for a fellowship over at ABC, or Disney Channel, sorry, in the ABC building. But then she came back and she went on Big Hero. So then I got to work with her again on Big Hero. And so I already knew, and just being on that floor, I already knew a bunch of people. So it didn't feel unfamiliar to me, but just the way they do things is different. And the transition is like, it was also different because I came on in season 3 of Big Hero. So they had all been working together, and they'd been working on the stories for 3 seasons, and I had to get caught up. So there was like a lot of reading, and there's like a lot of, like, I was so used to Tangled being like a second, you know, writing the voices of the characters was second nature. So kind of learning the rules of Big Hero, and like, you know, it's like Baymax, you know, writing for Baymax, which is really surprisingly really difficult, because you're writing a character with essentially no agency, other than to help Hero, like, but he doesn't have emotion, and you know, or anything like that. So it's like writing a character like Rapunzel, who's pure emotion, and writing, and then going to Baymax and that team. You know, it's not hard. It's just it is hard, but I mean, in a bad way. It's not hard. It's not like you resent it. It's just like it you start flexing different muscles, and you get rocked out of your comfort zone a little bit. But it makes you a stronger writer because you learn a new process. I work, like, our showrunners on Big Hero were Schooley and McCorkle, who Bob Schooley and Mark McCorkle, who did, they made Kim Possible, and they're veterans of the business. And so getting to work under them, you get to see how, like, other showrunners run things, and they're writing showrunners, so kind of working under them, like seeing how they handle notes, is just the way they handle notes is different than the way we did on Tangled. And yeah, so it's really just sort of expanding and letting go of some old habits and embracing some new ones. And then leaving that, they put me on a hold at the studio where they were basically just kind of like, I was sort of like jumping onto different things while I was waiting for like another staff position. And I got to work on Mickey, and like when you're working on Mickey, the Mickey shorts, they have a way of doing things that's different as well, which is like with every show you learn, kind of a new skill set, and you learn to write under different circumstances.
Yeah.
And in like a different style, because even the documents that they prepare, that their style of outline is different than Tangled's outline, is different than Big Hero 6's outline. Like they're all, and I know like a lot of times like writers, if I'm talking to an amateur writer, they'll be like, well, what does an outline for a show look like? I'm like, I don't know. It depends like what that show wants, like, because they're all different.
Yeah, and it's being susceptible to the different changes and being willing to make those adaptations when you need to. Yeah, that all makes sense, that you're going through the process of adjusting to a different team and a different character set and different story. Yeah, it sounds like it sounds exciting to be able to, be involved in all of these different things, but yeah, there's definitely an adjustment period when it comes to each one of them.
Yeah, and I mean, it's just cool to, like, I remember, like, when I first got hired on Tangled, and I went, and Big Hero 6 had just come out in the movies, and I went and saw Big Hero 6 in the theater by myself, because I was, like, by myself out in L.A., and, like, the castle comes up on screen, I was like, what, and I was like, oh, my God, so I was like, when I got on Big Hero 6, I was like, wow, like, I remember, like, going to see this movie, and now I'm writing for these characters, and, it's still the same in that it's not lost on you, but then it's also weird because, like I said, you're even though, like, Rapunzel and Eugene isn't, they're not real characters, they're not real people, you're like, you miss them, and you've got to kind of become friends with these new characters, and there's like a little, there's just like a little bit of an adjustment period, and then you get used to them, and then you have to move on again.
Oh, yeah, the never-ending cycle of working on these types of long-term projects, I'm sure, is just it's an emotional journey when you have to connect with each one of these characters and the stories that they're going through.
Well, it's one thing, like, I'll say that, like, I mean, naturally, like, fans can be, like, very, very passionate about things, but it's like, if you work on one of these shows, like, you certainly, like, I mean, like I said, you can, I don't want to speak for everybody, but, like, especially when you're writing it's like, nobody thinks about these things more than we do, because we're literally, like, I don't want to say nobody cares about that, because there's certainly, like, fans out there that, like, will get, like, they'll have, like, the lantern scene, like, tattooed on their back or something like that. Like, my level, I don't know that I go there, but, like, certainly, like, the level of, like, thought and care that goes into, and the that you feel for these characters, I mean, at least for me, like, is something that is ever present, and getting to move on to each show and, like, getting to meet these different characters where they are and work with them is, it's fun, and then it's heartbreaking when you have to leave.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a completely different type of experience when you spend your entire days thinking about these characters and the stories. It's something I've noticed just being someone who doesn't write for the characters, but does research about all of these movies all of the time and constantly trying to interpret what they mean and the different themes that are going on and the different lore that's happening. It's a completely different type of experience. Not saying that I understand what writing for the characters is like, but being involved in it all the time and having that be at the forefront of your mind is a different experience than just watching the movie and moving on.
Yeah, because when you watch the movie, it's like the difference is that when you watch a movie, all of the ideas are there for you, right? Mm-hmm. So like if I watch like, it's easy for me to watch Frozen and go, okay, well, why is everybody so amazed and frightened that Elsa shoots ice out of her hand when she creates sentient life? Like, why? Like, to me, that's the more that's the bigger, if I was like, hey, I made some ice cubes or I made an ice structure versus like, hey, Olaf's got a vocabulary and opinions and feelings, like, and he's just walking around and she just created him out of thin air. Like, to me, like, that's the kind of thing that I look at and I go like, well, why didn't they explore that more? Or like, how come Elsa's reaction in that movie is to that power, her just sort of gasping and looking at her hands, and then everybody just moves on. Now, it's easy for me to say that as a viewer, right? Mm-hmm. But when they're writing it in the story, like, they've got a reason that they don't do that, that they didn't do that or whatever. And
yeah, the experience is kind of different depending on what lens you're looking at it from or what perspective you're looking at it from.
Right. Like on Tangled, like one of the more frustrating things that I would see online, though I didn't really see too much like negative criticism, but like every now and then you hear people say like, oh, it's like a filler episode. And I'm like, well, like, we don't think of them as filler episodes. We think of them as like, if you want just straight, like, let's get through the plot, then go watch a movie, and a series is sort of, yes, it's got a trajectory of the plot, but like, if you think of, to me, like, a series is almost like a lifetime versus an event, mm-hmm. Like, the most important event in somebody's life would be a movie, and then their lifetime would be a series. Not that that's like one for one, but like, if we're talking about like, what's my trajectory from, being the kid at the gates of Magic Kingdom, showing Tigger my stuffed animal, to walking into the studio as a writer. Like, if that were a TV series, there's lots of little diversions, and moments that take place that aren't directly contributing to that thing, but they're building me up as a person, or they're taking those characters on side adventures and things like that. So when we look at those things, we're like, okay, our character is here. What's an adventure that happens while they're here that expands on, who they are, or maybe it will plant the seed for something later on, but you know what I mean? Like, mm-hmm. So whereas other people will be like, oh, well, you kind of go into it going, well, I want to know who Zontiri is. Tell me who Zontiri is. It's like, okay, well, we'll get there, but what you want and what the story is are like two different things. So,
and that's something, especially when you watch Tangled the Series, that I found is that typically when there were those episodes that I noticed weren't directly connecting with the plot, there was often a purpose for having that episode later on. That if it's a good show that's telling an intelligent story, there'll be payoffs for the things that are introduced throughout it. Like the House of Yesterday Tomorrow. Introducing that was like, what is going on? Having those types of like trippy episodes and those weird things that are happening, but eventually it all starts to weave together into something that becomes really important to understand. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the thing is, when you're watching it, when you're watching Great Expectations, you don't know that we're just basically emotionally setting you up to like Varian more so that we can knock him down more in the mid-season,
Yeah.
We're setting up, like, that just looks like a standalone science fair episode, but if you watch it now, like, we know when we're writing it that that's going to be, a setup, but it's an emotional setup, because some things, some things are plot setups, you know, and then other things are like, we're just making you like this character more. I mean, we don't say like that's maybe like a little bit too direct, but we're fleshing out certain things about the characters themselves, you know? So
yeah, Great Expectations is a good example too of spending time with these brand new characters, that because it was mainly a Cassandra and Varian episode, and that's one that I often look back to because it set up that Cassandra was with the captain of the guards when she was 6, so that ties into when she talks about that her father was adopted her when she was young, and this was Varian being able to show off his ability to be an intelligent alchemist as well. So yeah, it was an exploration of the new characters. In the moment, it didn't seem the most paramount to what was going on, but at that time as well, you didn't really know what was going to happen next. So yeah, it makes sense too that there's different types of setups and ideas that you want to focus on in each individual episode as you develop the series.
Yeah, or like Challenge of the Brave. Like when I was writing Challenge of the Brave, I fully was treating it as we're going to see, like, this is a glimmer of where we're going to be in season 3, or or at the end of season 2. Like, that Cassandra does have this competitive thing with Rapunzel. Like, there is this little, like, it's not just like, oh, we're besties. Like, there's this thing, there's this band. Do you know the Smiths? The band The Smiths?
No, I don't.
Oh, well, they're like a kind of like a 80s band or whatever, but they have a song called "We Hate It When Our Friends Become Successful," and it's a song that they have. And like, I just always thought of Cassandra with that, like, where it's like she is her friend, she legitimately is her friend, but it's like, you know, you could have a best friend, but it's that best friend, and you're still best friends, but when that best friend like wins the lottery and they come and pick you up in a Lamborghini and you're still like working in like the job, you know, in your like little 9-to-5 cubicle or something like that, and they retired and they're like going on vacation, you're like, there's like going to be a little, like a tiny little sliver of you that's like, why couldn't that be me? Why, you know? And like, you know, Challenge of the Brave is something that looks like a little one-off episode, but it's meant to be a shadow of that, you know?
Yeah.
So we did a lot of that.
Most definitely. That was something, as soon as DeManitis had the idea or planted the seed that someone was going to betray them, it started to all come together, that what was happening when you looked back at the episode you were just describing, and Freebirds, and the weird relationship at the House of Yesterday Tomorrow. It all began to start to come together, the rift that was slowly growing throughout the show, and with Waiting in the Wings and everything like that, you could see the trajectory once it started to be hinted at more directly. So I thought Tangled the Series really did a good job of making sure there was payoffs for everything that was set up.
Well, thank you. We tried.
Absolutely. So now that you've been involved with all of these shows, where do you see your journey going forward? What would you like to continue to accomplish into the future?
In the future, you know, it's a weird thing. Like, I remember when I was starting off, and I was just leaving school, I was like, you know what? If I could just like make enough money as a writer to just survive, I'll be happy. You know, just like, hey, I'm writing, and I'm like, because even like the Disney thing, when I started writing, I was like, I want to be a writer for Disney. Like, that's what I wanted to do once I like figured out that, like, and I didn't like really mention it in the, like, on my writing journey part of it, but like that was always sort of like my goal. You know, I was like, oh, I want to, like, one day I'd love to be a writer for Disney. And then like when I was writing at that studio, I was almost like, wow, like this is like kind of pretty close, because I'm working for former Disney people, you know. And working there, I was like, wow, like I'm happy. I'm making a living. I'm doing what I want to do. Hooray. But then every time you succeed, you end up, it doesn't end there, because you feel satisfied for a little bit, and then you start wondering, what's next. So when I went to, I remember like when I was trying out for Disney, I was like, oh man, if I get this, like that's it. I'll just be happy for the rest of my life. I don't need anything else ever again. And I would say also, like, I mean, if the rest of my career was just, going from show to show and hopefully more Disney shows, I would be happy ultimately, because I'm very happy with what I do, and I'm very happy. But if I had like my dream scenario is that I'd want my own show eventually. When you're a staff writer, you are contributing. That's Chris's, like Tangled's Chris's show, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they're not necessarily like, I mean, some of them are, Chris's characters, but like they're, they come from the movie and stuff, like, but they're not like I feel a lot of ownership over Tangled, but ultimately, like, that's Chris's show, and like you're contributing to Chris's vision, and Ben's as well, Ben's as well. But you're really like, you're fulfilling this story that he came up with, and you're passionate about it, and you want to make it as great as you possibly can, but you're not the boss. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not, and the boss is the wrong word, because I don't really want to, like, I don't enjoy, I enjoy working with people. I don't really enjoy like power over anybody. That's not what I mean, but there's stuff that when you're working on someone else's show, you have to compromise for them, or you have to bend to what they want. And there's characters within Disney, and then there's stories that I have that are my own, that I'd love to tell, and I'd like that opportunity,
Mm-hmm. For the chance to be able to have full ownership and control over the creative decisions that go into it, and be able to tell the story and create the characters that you want to make.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And like I said, I don't want to diminish, on Tangled. Like I said, Chris gave us a lot of freedom, and Jace gave me a lot of freedom, and Ben gave me a lot of freedom, and our ideas were welcome. And so it's not like I was walking around going like, oh, I just never get my idea. Like, but ultimately, like, that's what, like, it's there. You know what I mean? It's
Mm-hmm.
You're presenting ideas that will fit into their box. And so, like, I kind of, pie in the sky, someday it would be nice to have my own box. Mm-hmm. And to bring other talented people on and say, hey, help me fill this box up. I'd like to do that someday. I'd love to dream is be like, this is, I mean, there are things that are like, I've seen like Tangled things that exist that were my idea, and like they're in the, they're a toy, or something.
Yeah.
So I've seen that happen, but like, I don't know, it would be cool to have either an original story, like I have, original stories I've come up with, and it would be neat to have something like that get made, or my own version of certain Disney characters that I have a particular passion for.
Absolutely. And I wish you all the best of luck getting that opportunity one day to fill up your own box and tell your own story.
Thank you.
So finally, Ricky, I want you to tell the listeners what you feel is the number one piece of advice that would help them follow their dreams.
I would say the main thing is patience, is to be patient and treat your dream like a walk and not a run. Mm-hmm. Because I think where I've seen, like, I know with myself, and I mean, there's a few things, but like, patience is one, because it's like, if you feel like it needs to happen overnight, we live in like in an American Idol society where we see these dreams happen overnight, it seems like, and you don't see the behind the scenes of them struggling for like a long time until they get the opportunity, that door opens for them. And whether it's entertainment industry or just being a doctor or whatever whatever your dream is, there's this sense that like if it doesn't happen by the time I'm 25, I'm done. And like I actually did that with myself. I told myself, okay, well if I'm not at a certain place when I'm 25, I'm gonna just sort of quit. And that's what I did. I left New York City. I left, and that ended up working out for me. But I would never say, I mean, certainly if somebody wanted to be a professional writer or a filmmaker, I wouldn't say, yeah, you should probably move out of New York City and move to Orlando, Florida, and like, be a teacher. Like I wouldn't tell anybody to do that. But what I learned from that is that life is a long time, and you don't have to achieve everything not everything's going to happen in the time that you want it to happen. And I would say while you're being patient, so it's being patient with yourself, not looking left and right at what other people are doing or how fast other people are succeeding. So I know for me, it was really hard. Like I had friends that went to school for like finance or something, and they were like buying BMWs, and I was like, and buying houses and stuff. And I was like, I'm still really poor, and I still like don't, I'm like technically unemployed, and like so there's like a lot of that, and it sort of hurts I don't know, it hurt my heart to do that. So I think being patient with yourself and giving yourself time, but at the same time not allowing yourself to slack, because one of the things I didn't talk about too much was that while I was like going through all this waiting for this stuff to happen, I was also working really hard. I was writing. I keep myself on a pretty ridiculous writing schedule. Like from about 9:30 to 2 a.m. every night I write. Well, not every night, 6 nights a week. And I did that the whole time, except for that brief period of like kind of quitting and moving down to Florida. All the time, writing. So I'm always getting better, and I'm always working at it. So it's not just like sitting around, it's doing the work while you're waiting for that dream to come true.
Mm-hmm.
And you're being patient with yourself and with sort of the world to be in line with where you need to be. So I'd say like those two things is like be patient and be consistent in working towards it. Always check in with yourself and say, like, am I doing the most I can today to work towards becoming what I want to become? And then even if you're not there yet, being patient enough with yourself and the world to say, it's okay that I'm not there yet, but I'm still working towards it. And I think if you can balance those two things, again, there's never a guarantee that it's going to happen, but I feel like you'll be the happiest and you'll be on the best trajectory toward whatever that is.
For sure. It's the idea that it is a marathon, but that doesn't mean that you have to be taking breaks constantly. You have to keep moving forward and keep taking steps to move towards the thing you want to do. You've been able to grow and become a writer and channel your passion for Disney. So it's been so incredible to hear how you were able to achieve this and work on these amazing shows. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Ricky. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Isaac. It was awesome.
I'm glad you had a great time. To all of you who are listening, if you haven't seen Ricky's work before, I would highly recommend it, especially Tangled the Series. If you enjoyed this discussion, let me know by rating the podcast and subscribing. Also, it'd mean a lot if you followed my Disney adventures and discussions over on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube at Wotso Videos, and considered supporting the show by donating on Patreon and purchasing the Following Dreams merchandise, which will also be linked below. To all of you fun people who are out in the world, thank you so much for listening, and have a magical day.